Welcome to Standing for Truth. I'm your host, Donny Budinsky, and here at SFT, we stand firmly on the truth of biblical creation. Our mission is clear and unwavering to uphold and defend this foundational truth. Today, we continue our exciting series with part 2, Noah and the Flood in Ancient Egypt. Joining us once again is Gavin Cox of Answers in Genesis UK, a researcher who has delved deeply into Egypt's ancient records and uncovered powerful evidence that echoes the Genesis flood and the legacy of Noah and his family. This promises to be another fascinating and faith-building discussion. You won't want to miss it. Let's begin. Gavin, it's great to have you back. I feel like we were just here together for part 1, Adam and Eve in ancient Egypt, a fascinating presentation, an excellent discussion a couple weeks ago. And so, Gavin, how have you been, brother?
Yeah, I've been good. Thanks, Donny. Yeah, looking forward to part 2. Actually, this is my favorite session tonight, looking at evidence for Noah and the flood. So when you see some of the evidence, you'll absolutely be convinced that Ham took the knowledge of the flood and his father's teachings with him into ancient Egypt. And it's all there to be seen, very clear.
Oh, I love it. That's awesome. I'm excited. Therefore, any objective thinking person allowing the Holy Spirit to work through them here this evening should be convinced or persuaded by this evidence you're going to present. So I'm excited, Gavin. For the audience sake, I will remind them that because we've already got some discussion left over and generated from last week's presentation, Gavin. We had a good Q&A and conversation after the presentation. And so I'm looking at the live chat here. We're going to be doing the same format. So Gavin is going to be giving a comprehensive presentation, again, Noah and the flood in ancient Egypt. So please send in your questions. If you have questions of clarification or challenges, send those in as well. Of course, make sure you're being respectful and professional. And I'll have a series of my own questions, I'm sure, just like last time. So Gavin, let's get right into it, brother. I've got your slides now up on the screen where it says Answers in Genesis. And so you take as much time as you need for your presentation. The floor is yours.
Okay, so let's look at Noah and the flood in ancient Egypt. So if you didn't watch last week's session, then you might be thinking, why on earth am I looking in ancient Egypt for evidence for Noah and the flood? Well, that's the main question tonight. And we're going to look into evidence for it. So just before I start, I'll just introduce myself again. Like I did last week. Originally, I'm a Camborne School of Mines graduate, so I studied minerals engineering, and that got me into the oil industry later, and I actually worked in Egypt on and off for a couple of years. So I have first-hand experience of actually living in Egypt and learning Arabic and experiencing the culture, as well as going to the pyramids at least a dozen times, inside and out. Later, I did an honours degree in theology. I was at London Bible College. And later, I did a master's degree in biblical studies. And I began to study Egyptology there as well. I did an extra course on an introduction to Egyptology under a guy called Robert Morcott, who's very interesting. And he recognizes the need to change Egyptian chronology. It's overextended in many parts. So when you actually crunch Egyptian chronology down, it will start to fit with the biblical shorter chronology. And from there, I was inspired to go on to Birmingham University and did a master's degree in Egyptology. And I studied there. What I'm going to partly present on tonight is evidence for Noah and the flood. So I did my dissertation there on a group of gods called the Ogdode, and I'm going to talk about them tonight. And I got a distinction for my my dissertation. So you can be rest assured that what I'm going to talk about tonight is very well studied and reviewed, and it's all good stuff. So let's think about the Noah of the New Testament. He's the Noah of history, and we can start in Matthew 24. And Jesus upheld Noah and the flood as a historical event. And he said, "For as with the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be." So Jesus treated Noah and the flood as a historical event. The flood was global, and if Jesus treated it that way, as a historical global event, then so should we, if we're followers of Christ. And if you look in Luke 3, we have the genealogy of Jesus, and Jesus traces his genealogy back through David to Abraham, and then back through to the post-flood patriarchs, back to the flood patriarchs, Noah, his son Shem, and then right back through to Adam. So Noah and Shem, there are historical figures, as they're part of Jesus's genealogical tree. So all of those individuals in Jesus's genealogy are historical figures, just like in our historical trees, we have historical figures. So Noah and Shem can't be mythical figures, as Adam is thought to be by liberal scholars. No, they're historical figures. So last time I looked, historical figures didn't come from mythical figures. Only historical figures give birth to real life people. And then again in Luke, we have that same passage where Jesus is talking about Noah and the flood coming and destroying them all, again treating the historical Noah and the flood as real events in both Gospels there, Matthew and Luke. And if we go on in Scripture, Peter talks about the flood twice in 1 Peter and 2 Peter. So 1 Peter talks about God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water. And he goes on to make theological points about baptism. But again, Peter, the apostle, treating Noah and the flood and the 8 people on board the ark as a historical, literal event. And in 2 Peter, he goes on to say, he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. And Noah crops up in Hebrews 11. That's the famous Hall of Fame, or the famous Hall of Faith, I should say, famous Hall of Faith. And Noah is put forth as an exemplar of faith. The writer to Hebrews tells us in verse 7, by faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Just a couple of things to point out in 1st and 2nd Peter is that the family on board the ark are described as 8 persons, and then 7 others with Noah. So you can consider the 8 there as a single unit of 8, or 7 others with Noah. And keep that thought hanging as we look into the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. So this is the biblical testimony. Treats Noah as a figure of history and the flood as a global event. So let's look at Genesis. And when we recognize Genesis as a book as a whole, it covers a huge span of time, around 2,198 years of time from the creation, which according to the Masoretic timeline is around 4000 BC. And Genesis ends with the death of Joseph in around 1806 BC. So that all in all is around 2,198 years for the book of Genesis. So by far the largest span of history in all the books of the Bible. So we start off at creation and Adam. So he lived for all that amount of time. And all of the pre-flood patriarchs, they're living to almost 1,000 years. And there's Methuselah there, who dies in the year of the flood. His son was Lamech, and he actually outlived his son. And then Lamech gave birth to Noah, and he's the patriarch that spans both the pre-flood and the post-flood world. Noah had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And we would imagine that they lived to pretty much the same sort of age, which was about 600 years. So they lived around 500 years after the flood. And then the generations after Shem are Sfaxad, Salah, Eber, and Peleg. And in Peleg's time, that was when the division of Babel happened. And that's an important mark for us there, because the whole world was gathered together at Babel. And we would recognize that Noah and his sons would have been at Babel as well. So after Babel came Reu, Serug, Nahor, Terah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So they're all names that we know very well. And so that will be the pre-flood and the post-flood patriarchs. Now, interestingly, when we consider how these patriarchs could have actually interacted, Adam overlaps all of those pre-flood patriarchs up to Methuselah. So Adam and the 7th generation, that's Methuselah, overlap by 243 years. And then Methuselah was the grandfather of Noah, overlapped with Noah. And then after the flood, Noah would have overlapped Sfaxad, Salah, Eber, Peleg, Reu, Serug, Nahor, and Terah. And actually, after the flood, Noah died 2 years before Abraham was born in Ur, and he overlapped Terah by 128 years. And Noah was Abraham's great grandfather. So he's very great. And so Shem was the last person to see the pre-flood world, and according to the Masoretic timeline, died 25 years before Abraham died, living into Isaac's 50th year. And he actually overlapped Noah by 448 years. So when you consider all of that history, there were only 3 hands from Adam to Methuselah to Noah. So all of that knowledge of creation and the pre-flood world and the flood would have been handed on to Noah, who would have handed it on to his son Shem, and then down through the generations. And actually Shem outlived all of those Arphaxad, Salah, Eber, Peleg, Reu, Serug, Nahor, and Terah, and lived into Abraham and Isaac's time. And it's interesting to consider that perhaps Shem would have interrelated with Abraham and Isaac in some way. Now, this is a bit of revision from last time, but this is all very important groundwork that is very relevant to what we're talking about tonight. So we can make some predictions on the flood patriarchs' lifespans. So what of Noah and sons' lifespans? Well, Shem, Ham, and Japheth lived contemporaneously with Abraham and outlived everyone around them. So what of their influence in world history? They brought pre-flood knowledge and they restarted civilization. So they would have been considered creators of civilization. And for these reasons, I'm saying they were deified. So you get that right. Noah and his sons would have been deified by those who came after them, seeing how long they lived, seeing that they survived the great flood, that they passed on knowledge to restart civilization, technology, and agriculture. And their ancestors would have venerated them to the point of deification. So why Egypt tonight? That's the main question. Why look in Egypt for evidence for Noah and the flood and his sons? Well, we looked in Egypt last week for Adam and creation, and for the same reasons. So I'm just going to do a bit of revision with us. If you didn't watch last week, I'd encourage you to watch the pre-recorded show on Adam and Eve and creation and the fall, and the fact that they can be found in ancient Egypt as well. So the Bible reminds us in Genesis 10:6 that the sons of Ham were Cush, Put, Mizraim, and Canaan. And of course, Cush and Put and Mizraim are all names associated with Egypt. And Canaan is in the Levant, of course. So the Hebrew Bible, whenever it talks about Egypt, doesn't use that Greek word. It uses Mitzrayim in Hebrew, which of course is the name of one of Ham's sons. And every time Egypt crops up in the Old Testament, some 588 times, the Hebrew word Mitzrayim is used. And in the Psalms, in Psalm 105 and 106, Egypt is described as the land of Ham, and in Psalm 78, it's described as the tabernacles of Ham. So do you think we should look in ancient Egypt for evidence for Noah and the flood and his sons, and evidence for creation, etc.? I definitely think we should. So Egypt should be the first priority for evidence of Noah and his family and the flood. And we've already looked at the lifespans of the pre and the post-flood patriarchs, and their lifespans put them into Abraham's era, and using the standard revised chronology, that would have been around the 5th dynasty. So why haven't biblical scholars looked in Egypt for Noah and the flood? That's a good question, isn't it? It's mainly because of worldviews. Scholars don't believe in Noah and the flood, or Adam and Eve, or creation. So it's down to a materialistic worldview. So when it comes to creation and the flood, the main theory is that when Israel was in Exodus in Babylon, they came into contact with the creation and flood myths of the Babylonians and thought, oh, we'll have a bit of that, we'll make it our ancient history as well. And according to this theory, there were at least 4 different Jewish editors that compiled all this Babylonian mythology and made it into Genesis. And of course, that runs completely counter to what Jesus spoke about when it comes to the authority of Moses, and it runs counter to everything that the Bible itself teaches about Genesis and the Pentateuch, which is the work of Moses. So this idea has that the Genesis editors borrowed source material from Babylon during the exile for the creation, flood, and Babel accounts. So that's why biblical scholarship hasn't looked in Egypt for Noah and the flood. But having said that, I think the tide is beginning to turn, and that there are some good biblical scholars that have their feet in both camps, as it were, both in biblical studies and Egyptology. And so there are some biblical scholars who are also Egyptologists and are evangelical and have looked for evidence in ancient Egypt. So I've taken much, if you like, I've looked at what they've written and taken much courage from what they've said. Now, people like David Roll has actually said that there is no Egyptian flood story. And he said this, only the Egyptians among the major civilizations seem not to have had a flood story. And he's written 2 books on supposed evidence for Adam and Eve and Noah and the flood. But he doesn't look in ancient Egypt for these, which is, I find, rather strange because he's an Egyptologist. In fact, he goes to Mesopotamia and Sumer to look for evidence. And this other scholar said a similar thing. Egypt from time immemorial has been similarly subject to yearly inundations, yet it has never, so far as we know, either evolved a flood legend of its own or accepted the flood legend of its great Oriental rival. And I'm here to set the record straight that Egypt definitely does have a flood story, but it's possibly been misunderstood as a creation story. And so we need to tease apart the evidence carefully. But there is plenty of evidence for the flood in ancient Egypt, as we shall see in my talk. Now, when it comes to Noah and Ham and Shem and Japheth, are their names to be found in Mesopotamia and Sumer? There's been a number of different flood tablets that have been discovered. And this is Hilprecht's Nippur Semitic tablet. It's actually the oldest tablet. It's around 2100 BC. It describes the ark and the flood, and it also describes a family. And this actually predates Atrahasis. And the Babylonian Atrahasis from tablet C is something like 1966 BC. And it talks about its flood hero as Atrahasis. And then there's the Sumerian king list. I've actually seen this in the Oxford Museum, so it was great to actually see it for real. And it talks about a flood hero called Zeustra. And then there's the Gilgamesh epic, which we've all heard of. And that's the 7th century BC. And its flood hero is called Utnapishtim. And that's in tablet 11. And then there's a Chaldean account of Gilgamesh. And that account was translated by Smith. And its flood hero is called Sizit. Sizit, son of Ubaratu. And that's around 60 BC. And then there's a 3rd century BC Babylonian Marduk priest called Berosus, and he named his flood hero Zixtharus. That's a Hellenized or a Greek rendering of Zeustra. And then there's the Greek historian Atlantis by Hellanachus, and there's a particular papyrus called Papyrus Oxyrhynchus, 1084. That's early 2nd century. There's 2 other versions. There's a 5th century version, and the flood hero there is called Deucalion. And in 2 other versions, Greek versions, he's called Ogyges and Dardanus. So none of those flood heroes sound anything like Noah, and there's certainly no sons named. and the nearest you can get to it is the Hilprecht's Nippur Semitic tablet, which mentions a family. So possibly their names did originally exist, but because of the damage on the tablet, it no longer exists. So you can look in Babylon and Mesopotamia and Sumer, and you won't find any names like Noah and his sons connected with the flood. So that's why I'm showing you a picture of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Why haven't biblical scholars looked in Egypt for evidence of Noah and the flood? Well, there's a pivotal moment in this movie when Noah and his trusty psychic Sala recognize that the Nazis have been pouring oodles of brain and manpower into looking for the Ark of the Lost Covenant in the wrong place. They got their figures wrong. And of course, Indiana Jones was clever enough to get his figures right and calculate exactly where the Ark of the Covenant was, and they both recognize that they're digging in the wrong place. And I'm saying that biblical scholars, or rather the liberal biblical scholars, have been digging in the wrong place for nearly a couple of centuries. Mesopotamia isn't where you're going to find the best evidence. Now, Isaac Newton, he was a clever chap, and he recognized this from his readings of ancient history and the Bible. And he stated this: idolatry began in Chaldea and Egypt and spread from there into Phoenicia and the neighboring countries. The countries on the Tigris and the Nile rivers were exceedingly fertile and were the first to be inhabited by mankind after the flood of Noah. By all this, it may be understood that as the Egyptians who deified their kings began their kingdom with the reign of their gods and heroes. So Isaac Newton certainly believed in biblical history and recognized the implications for ancient Egyptian religion of the influence of Noah. So let's consider one particular event in the history of Noah and his sons, which helps us put us on the right track for understanding Egyptian history. And that was the event where Ham violated his father in some way, and Shem and Japheth sought to put things right. And Noah cursed Ham's son, Canaan, and indirectly cursed Ham, of course, in doing so. So what can we make of that? That Ham and his son Canaan didn't follow the righteous line, didn't follow his father's teachings or example. And so we would say that Ham, after Babel, went into ancient Egypt with his sons Mizraim, Put, and Cush, and they would have been the founders of the ancient Egyptian empire. They were the first pharaohs. And so Ham would have brought all of his influence with him into ancient Egypt, into the foundling empire. And so he would have brought his knowledge of his father's teachings about creation, the fall, Adam and Eve, which is what we looked at last week, and his personal eyewitness experience of the flood. He would have also brought with him, despite the confusion of languages, the names of his father and his brothers. He knew the meanings of their names, and how would have that affected Egyptian language, and how he related to his father Noah's teachings. Obviously, he didn't follow his father in his righteousness. He took with him paganized ideas and the knowledge of his father Noah and his teachings, which would have been handed on from Adam to Methuselah and then on to Noah, and then from Noah to his sons. All of that knowledge he would have taken with him into ancient Egypt, but which would have been paganized. So let's consider something very basic, shall we? The very name of ancient Egypt in the original language. So Egypt as we have it is from the Greek understanding, but the original Egyptians didn't call themselves Egyptians, they called themselves Chemi, and the survivors of the ancient Egyptians are the Copts, and they are the descendants of the ancient Egyptians. And actually the Coptic language is a development from ancient Egyptian, and the alphabet is written using Greek letters with a few added letters from Demotic Egyptian. That's the script that came after the Egyptian hieroglyphs. It was standardized in the 4th to 5th centuries AD by a monk who spoke ancient Egyptian and Greek. So the Coptic people themselves are direct descendants of the ancient Egyptians, who claim their own ethnic identity separate from Arab and African ethnicities. So they call themselves Chemi, and their Egyptian land Chemet, and that sounds just like Ham in the Hebrew. So that's Chemi in the Coptic language, and in the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs it's Kemet. And the Egyptian Arabs, so they would have come in through the Arab invasion in the 8th, 9th centuries. They call themselves Misri or Misraim, and that's directly from the Semitic Mitzrayim. So we have there, for the very names of ancient Egypt, Ham and his son Misraim. Now, isn't that interesting? And that's Masr there in Arabic. So let's just start to pull this all together and think about the implications of all that ancient history, from Adam through to Methuselah, through to Noah and his sons, including Ham, who went into Egypt with his 3 sons. And we can formulate some biblical predictions. And I'm going to formulate 8 biblical predictions, like I did last week, for evidence for the flood. So we're going to be looking in the oldest inscriptions, and that will be the pyramid texts. We're going to be looking for 8 names and 4 couples, because that's we're talking about Noah and his 3 sons and their wives. We were looking for creation and flood concepts that are directly parallel with Genesis. And of course, they were deified. So we'll be considering that these were the most ancient gods, which the pharaohs made reference to. And if they did really worship Noah and his family, then we should expect to find a temple dedicated to the 8. And we're going to look at the Egyptian versus the Hebrew names of Noah and his sons. So we know what the names of the meanings of Noah and his sons are in Hebrew in Genesis. Do they mean the same thing in Egyptian, if they indeed occur? And we know that Noah and his sons eventually died. Is there a tomb dedicated to the 8 in ancient Egypt? So there are 8 biblical predictions, and they all look like a pretty tall order if you think about it. But if the evidence is really there, then we can really drill down and find a lot of detailed evidence. So let's have a brief overview of Egyptian cosmogonies. And a cosmogony is a belief about the creation of all things, including the gods themselves. So that's rather different to the Hebrew understanding that God created everything and God is the uncreated one. But the Egyptians believed that the gods actually were created as well. So we have the first religion in Heliopolis, which I talked about last week, and that is where the sun god Atum was worshipped, and he is, as I said last week, the deified Adam. And in this particular temple, And this region, the idea of a primeval mound rising up out of the primeval ocean is there, and the god Atum sprang and started to create. In Memphis, that's just 20 kilometers south of Cairo, Men-Nefer, Memphis is the Greek version of the Men-Nefer, which means enduring and beautiful. Here creation occurred by a god called Ptah, who created Atum and the Aeneid, which is a group of 9 gods, and all things by thought and word. And again, the idea of the primeval mound coming up out of the primeval ocean is very central. And then Hermopolis, which is 323 kilometers south of Cairo, in the Egyptian is called Khumnu, and in the Coptic language is called El Ashmanein, which means city of the 8. The Greeks knew it as Hermopolis Magna, which is the Greek for the city of Hermes, which is a reference to the god Thoth, who we'll come across later, who the Greeks associated with their god Hermes. So again, in Hermopolis, the idea of the primeval mound coming out of the primeval ocean is absolutely central, and the 8 gods sprang onto the primeval mound. Now, this primeval mound is called the Ben-Ben, and we have here on the left an example of a Ben-Ben which is kept in the Cairo Museum, and it's the pyramidion of Amenemhat III, which is goes back to the 12th dynasty or the Middle Kingdom. And then if you go to the Great Pyramid on the Giza Plateau, you can see a reconstructed Ben-Ben. So that's the very tip of the pyramid. So in the hieroglyphic script, Ben-Ben is spelt like this. So you've got a little leg there, that's a B, and then a little squiggly line which means water, that's a N, so Ben-Ben. And then you have a determinative, that's something that helps you recognize what the spelling actually means, and that's a little pyramid. So that particular word goes right back to the pyramid texts. So J.P. Allen, he was a real expert in Egyptology and the pyramids, states this: the Ben-Ben was a pyramid-shaped mound symbolizing the first land that appeared from Nu at the creation, and Nu is the primeval ocean. So this is Gavin, and this is the Ben-Ben. Now, this idea of a primeval mound rising up out of the primeval ocean is actually a very biblical picture, and I can demonstrate that for you. So in Genesis 8, verse 4, this again is a bit of revision from last week as well. So again, this is all very important for us to lay the groundwork for Egyptian religion here. But in Genesis 8, verse 4, in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Genesis 8, verse 5b, and the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. So just imagine Noah and his sons and wives, they've been cooped up on the ark for almost a year at this point. And what did they see in the distance? This mountain rising up out of the ocean, the first land that they'd seen. It must have made a tremendous impact for them as they saw this mound rising up out of the ocean. And Ham would have seen that, and that would have had a great impact upon him psychologically and spiritually, and he would have taken that with him into ancient Egypt. Now this idea crops up again in creation, and Genesis 1 verse 9 states that God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." So that's dry land singular, waters plural. So in other words, the dry land came up out of the primeval ocean. And this idea of a mound or a mountain in paradise is there in Ezekiel, and God speaks to Satan and says, you were in Eden, the garden of God, you were on the holy mountain of God. So there was a mountain, or a primeval mound, in Egypt, in Eden, which Adam would have stepped on. And that's a really foundational concept for a creation, Egyptian creation belief. So there are two versions of the primeval mound coming up out of the primeval ocean. The first we spoke about last week, which was Atum springing up from the primeval ocean onto the mound where he started his work of creation, and that's in Heliopolis. And in the second version, in Hermopolis, the city of the eight, this idea again was believed that the primeval mound arose from the primeval ocean, and 8 gods sprang up and began their work of creation. So these are the Ogdoad of Hermopolis, and this is what I did my dissertation on in Birmingham. So I studied the Ogdoad, particularly from the oldest texts, beginning in the pyramid texts, moving on to the coffin texts, and then on to the Book of the Dead. So these are later images, and we can see the 8 gods of the Ogdoad on this beautiful temple frieze from Dendera Temple. And this is a relief from Ptolemy VI. So he reigned from around 180 to 164 BC. And their names appear in block cartouches above their heads. We'll have a closer look there. And we can see their names appearing above them. So they're 4 couples, male and female. And the females are shown snake-headed, and the males are shown with frog heads, and these are animals associated with water and flooding. And this idea of the Ogdoad occurs in many texts in ancient Egypt, and we'll just look at some of the later ones first. And this comes from the text in Fayum, and this book is highly esoteric text that describes the Fayum. This is an area in Egypt as the original site of creation and a center for the daily renewal of creation. And it references multiple creation myths, including the Ogdoad myth of Hermopolis and the Heliopolitan myth, incorporating them into the local theology of Sobek. So it kind of brings together a number of ideas together. And again, the names of the Ogdoad appear in this book of Fayum. So let's go back a bit further in history, in ancient Egyptian history, and look at the oldest illustrations of the Ogdoad and their names. And these occur in a place called El Bawati, which is in the Bahariya Oasis, which is some 375 kilometers southwest from Cairo. And there are tombs there from the 26th dynasty. And 2 of these tombs in the Oasis of Bahariya include inscriptions of the first attested example of the Ogdoad as a named group. So excavations at Bahariya Oasis was carried out by an Egyptologist called Fakhri in 1942 and determined the area to be at the peak of prosperity during the 26th dynasty. So 4 wealthy individuals from the village of El Bawati were buried in rock-hewn tombs. And within Tomb 2, the locations of inscriptions that name the Ogdoad are labeled A and B just there. So let's have a look at a diagram of these, and I'll just run through them with you. So these 8 apes represent the Ogdoad. So why on earth apes, you may ask? That's a good question. Glad you asked. And well, the apes here were considered animals that worshipped the sun. So if you went out in ancient Egypt at that time, you might see baboons, and they would have been hailing the sun. They'd have been lifting their hands. And the idea that the Ogdoad worshipped the sun on the first day of creation. Now you can see their names are written above their heads in hieroglyphs there, and they are helping support the sky. And this is a photograph of the actual images themselves. Beautiful yellow and red ochres inside these tombs, and again the Ogdoad there shown in their simian form. So we've seen them already with frog heads and snake heads, and now they're being shown as simian or apes. Yes, they made monkey out of Noah and his sons, unfortunately, but they also appear as human beings as well in many texts. But they're helping support the sky. And why are they doing that? Because the sky would collapse back into the primeval ocean if they didn't help support it. So they're stopping the flood returning. Isn't that interesting? So their names appear in block cartouches above their heads, and their names are Kek, Keket, He, Hehet, Amun, and Amunet, and Nu, and Nunet. Now, doesn't Nu sound rather like Noah? So these are the gods of the Ogdoad. Nu is described as the father of the gods. So we can put Nu and Nonet at the head. And we have Amun and Amunet, Kek and Keket, He and Hohet. And basically the feminine are the male version, just with the feminine ending, T in this case. So let's consider the meanings of the names of Noah and his sons. How do we determine what their names are before we start to compare the meanings of the names of this Ogdoad group? And while we go to the biblical text, this is Old Testament theologian Professor Gordon Wenham, and he said this, that play on similar sounding words, or paranomasia, or puns if you like, is a favorite device of Hebrew writers. The flood story has many puns on Noah's name. The key words in chapter 6 verses 5 to 8 make paronomastic allusions to the name of Noah. So you can read the Hebrew text and there'll be a word that sounds like Noah but has a specific meaning, and so we can understand how the biblical writer is punning or using the name of Noah to make a point. And this famously occurs with Lamech naming his son in Genesis 5 verses 28 to 29. So when Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief. And the Hebrew for relief there is Nehem, from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. So you can see in the Hebrew how Noah is played upon with relief or comfort. So we get the idea that Noah means comfort, rest, or relief. So we can have the semantic range of Noah, the name Noah and its meaning, worked out from the Hebrew. And so we can do that. And in Genesis 6:6 we have Nehem, which means be sorry, repent, regret, be comforted, or comfort, or care for. And Nehoah, which means a quiet, soothing, or soothing aroma. In Genesis 8:21, after the flood, the Lord smelled a sweet savor, and that was Nehoah. And so Noah made a Nehoah. He made a soothing aroma to the Lord from his sacrifice right after the flood. And that's when God renewed the covenant with Noah, the animals, and humankind. And Genesis 8 verse 4, there's a pun made on Noah's name with resting place or rest. The ark rested. Nah, in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. So Noah's name means rest or comfort, and the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat. And remember that Noah sent out a dove. Was it a pigeon? And that dove found no rest for its foot. And the dove in Hebrew is a yuna. So nah. Again, the pun is being made on the dove and the rest there. And later in Exodus, we also have another extension of that semantic range in Hebrew, where there's the idea of dwelling or abiding, where God guides Israel to his holy habitation, Naweh. So those similar sounding words in Hebrew help us to understand the meaning of Noah's name. And we can also repeat that with Shem, Ham, and Japheth, but we don't have time to do all of that tonight. But so we'll just concentrate on Noah. So let's ask ourselves a question. So this is question 1. Are there ancient Egyptian personal and divine names that are identical or similar phonetically to Noah and sons? What do I mean by that? Phonetically, it means the sound of the names. So would you expect to find a name that sounds like Hebrew Noah in ancient Egypt, or Hebrew Shem, or Hebrew Japheth, or Hebrew Ham in ancient Egyptian? And believe it or not, you do. So this is evidence that I looked for, and I looked in the oldest kingdom texts, and you find words like these. These are personal names. Okay, these are personal names. So Gavin is my personal name. So a personal name in ancient Egyptian in the Old Kingdom would be Nu, or Nui, or Nunu, or Nuah cow. So note that last one there, Nuah, is phonetically identical to Hebrew Noah. So there are phonetically identical and phonetically similar personal names to Hebrew Noah. So that might be a big surprise to you, that there are Egyptian ancient personal names that sound just like Hebrew Noah. So are there divine names that sound like that? And yes, there are. So these names were translated or transferred into divine names. So Nui, Nunu, Nu, or Nuwuwer. That's the great nun. And so these names exist from the Old Kingdom. That's the most ancient texts, right through to the New Kingdom and Roman periods. So this is one of our first predictions here coming true, that there are personal names that sound just like Noah, and divine names. So these are translated into divine names. So the second question is, are there ancient Egyptian personal and divine names with identical or similar semantic meanings to Noah and his sons? Obviously bearing the phonetic similarities. So do they sound the same, and do they mean the same? That's basically the long way of, if it sounds like a duck, walks like a duck, then it must be a duck. So that's the same method. And again, I looked for the roots in ancient Egyptian language for the sounding new sounds, and do they carry the same semantic range as the Hebrew meaning of Noah's name? So I looked hard and I found all of those different meanings, that the entire semantic range and some more for Nu. So we have Noah, the creator's concern for the world, and these come from all of the standard lexicons in ancient Egypt. So this is all scholarly lexicon work that came from the translation of the pyramid texts. Nui, take care of. Khunu, place of residence. Khanui, home affairs, place of residence. Khani, settle down, alight, stop, rest. Nani, be weary, be inert, subside. Nuer or Nunu, none, or the new divine name. Nuid, an aromatic anointment. Nunu, weariness, inertness, tiredness. Niwi, to come to rest, and that's a particular flood name as well that's associated with the flood. So Niwi. Khanu, resting place, abode. Manu, abode. Minute, dove or pigeon. And Nunu, primeval waters. So again, most of these are found in the Old Kingdom, and some exist right into the Second Intermediate Period and the Middle Kingdom and Ptolemaic periods. So that's a vast span of history that these names exist into. So what can we say? The summary for Noah is that he is equivalent to the Egyptian Nu. So in Hebrew, Naham, be sorry, repent, regret, be comforted, or comfort, or care for, is equivalent to Nuah, creator's concern for the world, or Nui, take care of. So Hebrew Nahwe means dwelling or abiding. Khunu, place of residence. Khunu, home affairs, place of residence, or the inner sanctum. Khani, settle down, alight, stop, rest. Manu, abode. Nehoah, in Hebrew, quietening, soothing aroma. And this is beginning to sound a lot like the Noah of the flood, isn't it? In the Egyptian, Nuid, an aromatic ointment. Nah, resting place or rest. Nani, be weary, be inert, to subside. Nanui, weariness, inertness, tiredness. Nui, to come to rest. And that is an actual flood term. So the resting of the flood waters. Khani, resting place, abode. Yonah, in Hebrew, dove or pigeon. In Egyptian, there's a manut, or dove or pigeon. And Nu or Nunu means the primeval waters. So I think we can see there that the entire semantic range for the Hebrew meaning of Noah's name is actually translated into the Egyptian chief of the Ogdod called Nu. And we can again remind ourselves of all of that family: Nu and Nonet, Amun and Amenet, Kek and Keket, Het and Hehet. And they are entirely equal to Noah and his three sons when it comes to the meanings of their names. So we've just looked at Nu and Noah tonight. We don't have time to make the same case for Amun, Kek and Heh, and Shem, Ham and Japheth. I've already done that. I spent a long time doing it and published it in 3 separate journal articles for the Journal of Creation. But I can just summarize what I found. Again, we've got the name Noah, meaning eminence, distinction, beauty, home, pasture, rest, settle down, quietness, soothing, resting place. And in Egyptian, Nu means eminency, distinguish, home, resting place, abode, floodwater, or wave. And those other meanings as well. Shem means name. Amun in Egyptian means to hide or be hidden. Amun directly means hidden of name. And when you take the root of Amun, it's men, which means so and so or someone, or menet, the like or contents. And it also means origin of the waters. Ham, father-in-law in Hebrew, means father-in-law, hot, heat, dark and dark brown, or black or violent. In Egyptian, the equivalent Ogdod couple, Kek and Keket, means darkness or attacker, and also has a floodwater epithet. Japheth means be spacious, wide, open, and the equivalent Ogdode member is He, which means millions, or to seek, or eternity. So similar concepts there to spacious, wide, open. Now, interestingly, both Nu, Amun, Kek, and He have floodwater epithets attached to them. So those are divine names that are intimately attached to those names, which mean floodwater, wave, or origin of the waters, or to flood. So if you're interested in reading up on more of that, I've published that in this journal. I started a series in the Journal of Creation, and I headlined on this particular journal article, Noah and the Flood in Ancient Egypt. So you can order that from creation.com, or just look online for the free PDFs which you can download, or the free articles which are online. So the Search for Noah and the Flood, parts 1, 2, 3, and 4, published in 29 through to 2020. And then Horus, the deified Ham, parts 1 and part 2. So that's a lot of work gone there that's been peer reviewed by other Egyptologists, professional Egyptologists. So in other words, when you compare the meanings of the names of this group of gods, the Ogdode, they compare very dramatically to the meanings of Noah and his sons. So let's continue. So how old are these names? Well, my prediction was that they can be found in the 5th dynasty. And by the end of the Old Kingdom, texts were being inscribed on the walls and corridors of the pharaoh's pyramids, and they're located on the plain of Saqqara, that's some 20 kilometers south of modern Cairo, known by modern scholarship as the pyramid texts. So the pyramid complex of Unas is located in the pyramid field at Saqqara. It's ringed red on the map there, and they contain the pyramid texts, which is the oldest religious writings in the world. So we have texts that are older than the pyramid texts, but they tend to be things like tax receipts or various sort of non-religious texts. So the pyramid texts are the largest and oldest group of religious writings in the world. So this is the oldest pyramid. This is me with the Saqqara pyramid behind me. That's built by Josa. So this is me being a tourist in 1999. This is while working in the oil industry. So some of these pyramids I'm showing here. Pepi the First, that's the 5th dynasty pyramid, and this is the Unas pyramid. The smaller pyramids were his queens, and they also contained pyramid texts. This is Pepi II. So these are reconstructions or models of what the pyramid complexes would have looked like. So if you go inside, you can actually see the pyramid texts adorning the walls. This is on Unas's pyramid, and the names of the Ogdode occur in the pyramid texts. So pyramid text 301-446, we have the pairs Nu and Nonet, Amun and Amenet. Pepi II, we have Kek and Keku. And interestingly, these are the hieroglyphs for Amun and Nu as well. And we'll go back to that particular hieroglyph a bit later, because it's very significant. In Pepi the First pyramid, we have the He gods, and that was the other name of the Ogdode there. So Nu, Nunet, Amun, Amenet, He, and Hehet, Kek, and Keket. And here we have the He gods, and they're particularly described here as the sky support gods. So they keep up the sky from collapsing back into the primeval ocean. There's the hieroglyphics there. Note the one on the far right is a little seated deity with his arms raised up, so he's helping to keep the sky from collapsing back into the great flood. So when it comes to the names of the Ogdoad, they all appear in the pyramid texts, including the actual name of the group, or possibly referring to the place where they were worshipped, the Khumnu, or the Eight. So that's all of the occurrences of the different names of the Ogdoad there. So they go right back to the pyramid texts, the oldest texts in the world. So this is from my MA dissertation. All the Ogdoad names occur as cosmological concepts and divine names, sometimes together, sometimes singularly. And the name of the Ogdoad is the earliest mention of their worship temple, actually occurs in the pyramid texts. So we'll turn now to the development of the funerary texts into the coffin texts. So all these texts that we find in the pyramid texts, I must mention this, they were spells for the afterlife to help the pharaoh gain access to the afterlife. And so all these different spells would be recited by the pharaoh to help him pass through the various different gates that he had to get through, and the various challenges that he'd have to meet in getting into the afterlife. So the coffin texts were basically texts from the pyramids that were written onto the coffins, and we'll have a look at that a bit later. But here's another coffin text that a pyramid text that I want to look at, in the pyramid of Neith and Pepi I. And it states this, that Re, Neith has denied the injustice for the Lord Thoth of Hermopolis, the Ogdoad. Neith is their eighth. So that's a rather esoteric spell that's mentioning Hermopolis, which is where the Ogdoad were worshipped, and the lord of the Hermopolis, who's Thoth. And this is the actual hieroglyph, which is a very interesting looking hieroglyph. So we're going to have a look at that a bit later. So that's the hieroglyph for the Ogdoad, or the Khumnu. So onto the coffin texts, and the pyramid texts were written onto coffins of wealthy individuals who also wanted to get into the afterlife, and many of the pyramid texts were written on coffins. This particular example is very interesting for us. So this was found in a place called El Bersha, which is the chief cemetery of El Ashmonain, or Hermopolis, which is where the Eight are worshipped, and I'll go on to talk about El Ashmonain a bit later. So this particular coffin is very apt for what was believed there. So the ancient Egyptian coffin texts represent funerary spells adorning coffins during the Middle Kingdom. So that's from about 1980 to 1760 BC. Coffin texts are so called because they were written in ink on interiors and more rarely exteriors of coffins belonging to wealthy Middle Kingdom Egyptians. So the Ogdoad occur in the coffin texts, and the following coffin text spells are of interest from the point of view of discussing the origins of the Ogdoad. So there are a number of coffin texts that mention the 8 chaos gods, and the Ogdoad names Nu and Amun occur. So coffin text 1130 is very interesting because it contains a flood judgment. And so some 1,185 coffin texts have been published so far. And the terms Khamanu, which means 8 city, and 8 chaos gods appear together in coffin texts along with the Ogdoad names as an impersonal cosmological concepts. So this particular coffin text states, I made a great flood. I forbade them to do wrong, but their hearts disobeyed what I'd said. I will navigate aright in my bark, for I am the Lord of waters. Prepare a path for me that I may see Nu and Amun. So again, we have the names of the Ogdoad, Nu and Amun there. and they appear in a text describing a great flood that was brought in judgment, and a bark, or an ark if you like, in which they travelled. So that's a very clear text. And the text reads like Genesis flood account, doesn't it? The divinity is responsible for sending the great flood due to the divine complaint of wrongdoing. And a boat for navigating the flood is mentioned, and the names of the Ogdoad, Nu and Amun, are mentioned. So this is direct evidence for ancient Egyptian belief having a flood sent in judgment. So it's not just the Nile flooding for the good of ancient Egypt. There was an idea of a great flood that was sent to punish evil. So the next prediction, if you like, is the great pharaohs mentioning the Ogdoad, and who but this pharaoh is the most readily recognized pharaoh. This is Tutankhamun, of course, from the 18th dynasty. He ruled from 1332 to 1323 BC in the New Kingdom. Now, Tutankhamun means living image of Amun. Of course, Amun is one of the names of the Ogdoad, Amun and Amunet. By this time, of course, Amun had become an important god in his own right. So the son of Akhenaten, age 9 or 10, reigned when Egypt was a world power, and he rejected religious innovations of his father. So he came after Akhenaten, and we would say that Akhenaten probably came after the Exodus. So he recognized that the gods of Egypt had failed, and he brought Egypt back to an idea of monotheism under the sun god. And in 1922, Howard Carter found the intact tomb of Tutankhamun, and it received worldwide press coverage at the time, sparking renewed public interest in ancient Egypt. And I've seen Tutankhamun's mask in Cairo. It's absolutely stunningly beautiful. So in Tutankhamun's tomb artifacts, we can find reference to the Great Flood and the Eight. This might be news to you, but it's absolutely true. So within the actual burial implements and things found in the tomb of Tutankhamun were these funerary chapels. And so these were found from the Valley of the Kings, KV 62. And there are 4 chapels. The innermost one contains the pharaoh's sarcophagus, made of wood and decorated with gold. And here be references to the flood, believe it or not. So inside one of these gold boxes is reference to the Great Flood and the Eight in the main Tutankhamun chapel. And this is a diagram of inside this particular funerary chapel, and it's been translated by Miriam Lichtheim, who's an Israeli translator of ancient Egyptian texts. And she states this: this mythological tale forms the first part of a longer text known as the Book of the Heavenly Cow. The first part relates how the sun god Re set out to destroy the human race because mankind was plotting rebellion against him. She goes on to say that the interest of the tale lies, of course, in the theme of human wickedness, arousing the divine wrath and resulting in a partial destruction of mankind, a theme that received its classic treatment in the Mesopotamian and biblical stories of the flood. So we need to look a bit closer than Miriam Lichtheim looks and actually interpret the image here. So the heavenly cow is called Mehet Weret, which means great flood. And as you can see on her stomach are stars. So she represents the heavens. And in the middle in yellow, we have Shu, who is the air god. And he was separated from Geb, the earth god in creation. And we also have the god Ra sailing in his boat across the heavens. That's the little one in yellow. Now the 8 He gods are in red, and they're helping Shu support the sky. And if they don't do that, then the sky will collapse back into oblivion, or the primeval ocean. So the sky will collapse back into the primeval ocean, and everything will return as it was at creation. So the He gods are in red, and they help support the heavens. So the image of the cow is framed by the inscription, words spoken by the cow, the great flood. Come, my son of my body, my beloved, Lord of the 2 lands, Nebkefre Re. Be with thy father Re as one of these gods who are in his following at the side of the cow, the great flood. Osiris, King Tutankhamun, ruler of Heliopolis of the south, lives. He will not die again in the necropolis. So this is the inscription that we can find in Tutankhamun's funerary shrine. Now we go on to the Book of the Dead. So after the coffin texts, we have the same spells being written on papyrus that could be afforded by more individuals to be put in their tombs when they die. And of course, these spells are supposed to help them into the afterlife. So the Book of the Dead was known by the Egyptians as the coming forth by day, and has a history that spans 1,500 years, from 1450 BC to 50 AD. And at the start of the New Kingdom, the Book of the Dead was still in the process of formation, and only by the Sate period, which is the dynasty 26, did the Book of the Dead reach its final canon, where all of the spells were organized into an established order of chapters. And again, the Book of the Dead contains beautiful colored vignettes, as we can see here, and the Ogdode also occur in the Book of the Dead, and the texts that refer to the Ogdode include the Book of the Dead 27, and there are other spells that mention the Ogdode. And we're going to have a look at some famous examples here. Here's one that I showed last week, but it's definitely worth showing again. So this is from the Book of the Dead. This is the Book of the Dead vignette showing the Ogdode from the 21st dynasty papyrus of Khensumose, priest of Amun. It illustrates the Ogdode hoeing the world on the primeval mound at the first sunrise, signifying the world's creation. They're surrounded and have emerged from the primeval ocean. So it's quite a long papyrus, and this particular section shows the primeval mound. And just imagine, after the flood, Noah and his family, they disembark the ark, and what do? They start agriculture for the first time. So they must have been hoeing the ground, starting agriculture. And actually, Noah, he planted a vineyard. And interestingly, in the Hebrew, it says Aish ha'adamah. Noah became a man of the soil, or literally an Adam of the Adamah. If you remember the puns made in Genesis chapter 1, 2 and 3 on Adam being made from the soil. So Noah is the second Adam, and his family would have been hoeing the soil of the primeval mound, or the mountains of Ararat. And in this particular papyrus, we see 2 goddesses pouring out the waters of the Nu, or the Nun, onto the primeval mound, and we have the sun rising and setting, and it sets in the twin horizon at the top there. And I just want to show you that hieroglyph again. This is the hieroglyph of the Ogdode. And isn't it interesting when we consider the primeval mound? We have the group of the Ogdode stepping out on the primeval mound from the primeval ocean at the setting of the sun on the first day of creation. So this is the flood. Egypt's flood stories is the the idea of the primeval mound in Hermopolis, where the group of 8 came out and started creating. Egyptologists consider this as another creation story, but it actually is a flood story, because Noah and his family were creators. They recreated agriculture, civilization, and technology after the flood. And this is exactly how the Egyptians remembered them. Here's another papyrus. This is an image of Nu. He's standing in the Nun, holding up the solar bark containing 7 gods, or the Ogdode and Re. It's a very important job. Again, if Nu didn't uphold the sun bark, then everything would return to the Nun as in the days of creation. So he's stopping the flood returning. So this is an image seen on temple walls in the New Kingdom tombs of the Valley of the Dead. The kings, including Ramesses VI, where the descending shafts and associated images of Nun depict a return to Nun as an image of rebirth of the deceased. And it's also depicted in the 19th dynasty Book of the Dead, Papyrus of Ani, which is what I'm showing you here. So Nu is holding up the bark, or is it Noah holding up the ark? So Genesis 6:15 to 16 gives the ark's dimensions as 300 by 50 by 30 cubits. And coffin text 759 gives the dimensions of the enormous solar bark. 1,000,000 cubits are half of the length of the bark, starboard, bow, stern, and larboard. That means port, are 4 million. So that's the description of the solar bark in the coffin texts. And again, million is played on in Egyptian, and the word there is He, which is one of the Ogdode names. So in this papyrus, we have a blue section in the middle with 8 dots, or 8 circles, and that's representative of Hermopolis, where the Ogdode were worshipped. And we also have at the bottom there a depiction of the double staircase in Hermopolis. And if you think that looks familiar, then again, I'll just show you the hieroglyph for the Ogdode there, the primeval mound coming out of the primeval ocean on the first setting of the sun of the first day of creation. And we have the deity there, no, not the deity, rather the person being buried is the owner of the papyrus, and he's been placed on the double staircase in Hermopolis, just there, and I've just put it in a yellow rectangle for us to look at just a moment. And if you think that looks familiar, that looks just like the first pyramid, doesn't it, in Saqqara. The stepped pyramid even has the same amount of steps. So the pyramid itself, as the Ben, is also considered the steps or stair or the ladder to heaven, upon which the divinity would step out of the primeval ocean and start creating. And if you were buried inside that, you would be guaranteed a resurrection into the afterlife. So the idea of the primeval mound or the pyramid, the steps or the ladder to heaven, is a resurrection machine, if you like. So we have another papyrus here. This is from the Book of the Dead of Ani. It's early 19th dynasty, and it has a very clear reference to the flood sent in judgment. And it states, O Thoth, Thoth is the lord of Hermopolis, where the Ogdode were worshipped, and I'll talk about Hermopolis in a little bit. States, O Thoth, what is to happen with the children of Nut? They have made tumult, they have raised strife, they've done evil, they've formed rebellions, they've caused slaughter. You shall not see evil, you shall not suffer, Their years are limited, their months are closing in, and I shall indeed destroy all I made, and this land shall turn into none, as a flood water as its original condition. So those lines are excerpts from a larger text, but when they're compared with Genesis 6, some really startling things jump out at us. So I'll just read you Genesis 6. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were daughters of men were attractive, and they took of their wives all that they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, his days shall be 120 years. Moving on to verse 5, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I've made, animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I've made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. So we have the divine complaint, and it talks about violence and mankind's rebellion, and also the purity of the flood hero is described in the papyrus, and also the restriction of the years of the children of Nut. These were the children that Atum created, humankind. So when we consider the parallel with the Genesis flood account, it really does strike us as very compatible. There's also another version of the this particular flood curse in papyrus, Leiden, and in 1904 Neville in the Egyptologist published translations of 2 Egyptian texts describing the global flood that destroyed mankind. Both variant texts describe a conversation between Thoth and Tum, who appear as the judging gods, and the flood heroes Osiris, Horus, and Set. So Egypt certainly does have its idea of a flood sent in judgment. And we can consider all of these texts together. And this particular papyrus actually makes puns on the names of the Ogdoad. So these are the different lines in the Egyptian papyrus. And we have Amun here, which means hidden. We have Kekut, which means darkness. Heh means, and Hehu means seeking and millions. Hehu again there in millions. Nanu, the land shall turn into none. And Huhu is a variant spelling of Hehu, which means flood water. So just like the Genesis text puns on the name of Noah and his sons, this particular papyrus puns on the meanings of the names of the Ogdoad in this clear text describing the flood. So that's very powerful evidence that the idea of Noah and his family connecting to the flood were translated into ancient Egyptian in a similar flood text. So we have the coffin text 1130, we have the heavenly cow, and the Book of the Dead chapter 175, which are all clear references to the flood. And they also contain the idea of 8 gods and even pun on the names of the Ogdoad in the Book of the Dead chapter 175. So let's move on later into history. So there's a collection of 50 papyrus letters that were written in hieratic. That's this scrolling version of Egyptian hieroglyphics, dated to the end of the Ramesside period. So that's the 20th dynasty, or 1070 years BC. They've been collected and studied. So of interest to this presentation are 4 of those letters referring to the Ogdoad of Hermopolis as part of their lengthy introductory blessings and invocations. And so these letters actually blessed various people that are named in the letters by the Ogdoad. So it's like saying, I bless you in the name of Noah and his sons. So they also represent an incidental written testimony to the tradition of the association of this place called Hermopolis in the Greek, or El Ashmonain in Coptic, or Humane in Egyptian language, with the Ogdoad, that they were buried in this place. So these are the papyrus that talk about these inscriptions referring to the Ogdoad. So Ammon, holy place, and the great and august Ogdoad, upon Amun of Jim, as Medinet Habu, upon Amun of the thrones of the 2 lands, upon the great and august Ogdoad. Another letter upon the great and august Ogdoad that rests in this particular place on the Nile, which refers to Hermopolis. Upon Khnum, who is fashioned the great and august Ogdoad that rests in the promontory of this place, who made for them the hills in which you are upon a mount, upon Ammon, or Medinet Habu. So we'll go on to think about where the Ogdoad were worshipped. And they had their chief center, Khumanu, which means 8 town. This is the Hermopolis temple. And this is some 322 kilometers south of Cairo. And you can go there today. And the modern name is called 8 town. And it's El Ashmonain in the Coptic language. So you can drive from Cairo and see road signs for this particular city called El Ashmonain, which means 8 town. And I'm saying that this is named after Noah and his family. So the ruins are deep underground, and nothing much remains on the surface because they've been mined by the Egyptians themselves for stone. But you can actually go to this place and there would have been an original temple dedicated to the worship of the 8. And the next mention of the Ogdoad occurs in the 25th dynasty victory stela of Pianki. So Pianki, or Pi, he's actually mentioned in the Bible, an invading Nubian king who reigned from around 753 to 723 BC. During the 25th dynasty, he actually took over part of Egypt, and during his battles he went into Hermopolis temple where the 8 gods were worshipped, and this particular granite stela mentions the Ogdoad of El Ashmonain, or 8 city. So that's the hieroglyphs there. And when they're translated, it states this: His Majesty arose in splendor from his palace and proceeded to the temple of Thoth. So we've already mentioned Thoth. He's the lord of Khemenu. He sacrificed oxen, shorthorn, and fowl to his father Thoth, lord of Khemenu, and the Ogdoad in the temple of the Ogdoad. So this particular Pianki stela is a testament to the worship of the Ogdoad at this place. So Noah and his sons were worshipped at this place as primeval gods, very important to the Egyptians. And remember, their name are mentioned in the 5th dynasty pyramid texts along with Khemenu, or the city of the 8. So then we have Thoth, lord of the Ogdoad, or lord of Khemenu, that's in red there, and again Thoth, lord of Khemenu, and the temple of the Ogdoad in hieroglyphs there. And we also find a big baboon statue and that was discovered by an Egyptologist called Abu Bakr, who's argued that there were 8 originally, which would be consistent with the Ogdode known from tradition. So again, the baboons worshipping on the primeval mound sunrise after creation. So let's go on to another place called Medinet Habu, which is 633 kilometers south of Cairo, for the final resting place of the Ogdode. Also here at Luxor is Thebes, where a creation theology centered on Amun and the Ogdode occurred. Thebes was the ancient capital of Egypt during the Middle and New Kingdoms and is located in modern-day Luxor. Known as Wasset to the ancient Egyptians, it was a major political center, famous for monuments like the Karnak Temple complex and the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Today, the ruins of ancient Thebes are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, showing the height of Egyptian civilization. So this is the 20th dynasty Medinet Habu, and of particular interest to us is the 18th dynasty Amun Temple, along with its sacred lake, which represented the Nun, or the Nu, the primeval ocean. And here it is reconstructed from evidence. This is what it would have looked like in the 18th dynasty. And this is the tomb of the Ogdode. So the Amun Chapel was believed by the Egyptians to mark the location of the final resting place of the Ogdode. It's very interesting, isn't it, that the idea of the ancient Egyptians, their gods died. Well, if they died, perhaps they were deified ancestors who died eventually. So the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago excavated at the site of Medinet Habu from 1926 to 1933 and published a number of reports, 14 in total, and describing the architecture and the hieroglyphs. So this is one of the main gates to the temple, and the Ogdode are actually shown on the lintel of the gate here. So this is the bark shrine in here, or ark shrine if you like. So a model of a wooden boat would have been kept in here, and the gods were thought to go in the boat and sail on the primeval ocean. So Ptolemy the 8th and Cleopatra the 2nd shown worshipping Amun and the Ogdode on the east doorway of the bark shrine. So in the left scene behind Amun-Re sits variations of spellings of the Ogdode names: Amun-Nun, Amunet, Nunet, and then Keku and Keket, also shown receiving incense and libation offerings from Ugetes II. And in the right scene, Amun is depicted receiving a wine offering from the king, accompanied by Ihi and Ihit, and then Nu and Nuet. So slight variations of spellings on the Ogdode name there. Now, interestingly, on the lintels and the jambs of the doors, they're covered in hieroglyphics, and the text within the bark shrine contains striking references to the flood. Yes, that's the global flood. And it states this: the noble fathers who brought into being the beginning, who shone in none when the land was in utter darkness, and every existing thing was flooded, who opened the light after the utter darkness when they were brought none in his cloudburst. And it also goes on to describe how the Ogdode were interned here in their mummy wrappings. So Maclean, who published one of these reports, he's an Egyptologist in 2011, states, as an expanded description of the purpose for the shrine's renewal, these texts illuminate the characteristic of Amun, in particular as the father of the great elder one Re, and as the great Ba of Kumatef, who comes forth here at the Mound of Gem to receive funerary offerings. We learn also of the cult of the Ogdode, who sleep on the Mound of Gem, that's the primeval mound, interned in their wrappings, their members being within it. And he who declare that this Mound of Gem, the resting place of our moon, is the funerary abode, these texts declare unequivocally to be the locus of the mortuary cult of these deceased creator deities. And again we have Medinet Habu with Ptolemaic pylon. And I'm asking, is this the tomb of Noah and the family? So certainly the Egyptians believed that the Ogdode were buried here. And if it really was the tomb of Noah, we'd expect evidence of even more ancient structures beneath. And interestingly, reports in 1939 from the small temple describe unidentified subterranean chambers discovered beneath the 18th dynasty Amun temple, filled with dark sand and of unknown function. This Egyptologist called Hulsher discusses the possibility of finding more pits existing beneath the floors of other rooms within the temple, but this has been left unresolved even to this date due to the desire not to disturb the ancient pavements in these rooms. Is this tomb the tomb of Noah and his family? Well, the Egyptians believed it was the tomb of the Ogdode. So Noah and his wife, they can map on to the Ogdode family there. And we also remember that Ham had 4 sons, Mizraim, Put, Cush, and Canaan. And one of those couples of the Ogdode also had 4 sons, when we recognize that Kek translates into Horus. And I've actually published 2 articles for evidence for that. And Horus had 4 sons, Imseti, Jumatef, Kepsenef, and Happy. So I will leave that with you. There is even more evidence for Noah and his family in ancient Egypt, and Ham and his family as well. They were all deified as the Egyptians' most ancient gods. So let's just wrap this up and come to an end here for taking your time tonight. So the 8 biblical predictions based on the Genesis text and the implications of that vast amount of history, and Noah taking the teachings of creation and the flood, passing that on to his sons, and Ham taking that with him into Egypt and paganizing those ideas. So the predictions are that we would find all of this in the oldest inscriptions, and we have. We find these in the pyramid texts, which are the oldest religious texts in the world. We have the 8 names, 4 couples that map directly onto the semantic range of Noah and his sons, and the very meanings of their names in Hebrew map onto the names of the Ogdode. The idea of creation and the flood is very profound in ancient Egypt, particularly in this idea of the primeval mound rising up out of the primeval ocean, and the god Atum creating, which is Adam, which was the first talk a couple of weeks ago, and then the next version, which is the Ogdode coming out onto the primeval mound and creating on the first day after the flood. And these were deified ancestors of the ancient Egyptians. And we predicted that they would be found in the pharaonic references. And so they are, from the pyramid texts, from the pharaohs right through to very famous pharaohs like Tutankhamun. They have a dedicated temple to their worship in a place called El Ashmonain, which can be found today in Egypt, some 322 kilometers south of Cairo. You can drive to a place called 8th City. And the Egyptian names map onto the Hebrew names of Noah and his sons very dramatically. There's even a tomb of the 8, which the Egyptians believe the Ogdode were buried there. And if the Ogdode really are Noah and his family, could it be that Noah and his family are actually buried in Egypt? Who knows? So, 8 detailed biblical predictions beautifully fulfilled in ancient Egypt. So when we start with God's word as the foundation to all our thinking, including human history, we can make some startling discoveries. When we look at ancient Egyptian history through the lens of scripture, we see much shared ideology. So I propose a common source. It's Ham, son of Noah. And my conclusion is the ancient Egyptians knew about some key creation and flood concepts, including Noah and his sons' names, and that they were worshipped as Egypt's primeval gods. So when we start with the Bible, what we see in the ancient world lines up with what we read in God's word. And if you'd like to dig into some more things like this, I can offer you some great resources by Answers in Genesis. So other authors have looked at legends of law and survival that sound strikingly like the flood of Noah in different cultures around the world. So Bodie Hodge and Laura Welsh have looked at different cultures around the world and drawn incredible conclusions that this memory was not just translated into Egypt, but has been taken around different cultures around the world. If you want a book of a nice read, there's a novel called Noah, Man of Destiny by Tim Chaffee and Mary Adams. If you want something for the kids, N is for Noah by Ken and Mally Ham. And we also do Patterns of Evidence DVDs. They're great series by Tim Mahoney that look for evidence of Israel in ancient Egypt, the Red Sea miracle, journey to the Mount Sinai, etc. If you want to find more writings of myself, if you look into the ICC, that's the Proceedings of the 7th International Conference of Creationism in 2013. I published all of these ideas in Nucleus, if you like. These are my first delvings into creation and the flood in ancient Egypt. And that basically was the impetus, if you like, to go on to do my master's in dissertation in Egyptology. And if you want to see more of what I've written, go on to creation.com. You can read about what's the point of the pyramids. It's in the Journal of Creation. And it's also on creation.com on the website as well. The search for Adam and Eve and creation in ancient Egypt in the Journal of Creation as well as Horus, the deified Ham. So Ham was deified as one of the chief gods in ancient Egypt, Horus. And I look at multiple lines of evidence for that. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll hand back to you, Donny. Thank you for any questions.
Gavin, thank you. That was my kind of presentation, comprehensive, informative. We like those around here, the kind of presentations that leave no stone unturned. And from what I can tell, irrefutable. I mean, that was excellent. I have so many notes there. The 8 deities preserving a recollection of Noah and the flood, obviously a distorted version, of course. That's how these things work. With the 8 survivors who stepped into a new world after the flood. That is incredible. That confirms several scriptures, of course, but Genesis 9:19, from these the earth was overspread.
Yeah.
Shem, Ham, Japheth, their 3 wives, of course. The 8 referring to Noah and his wife as well. Isn't it incredible that wherever we look, we have confirmation, Gavin, of exactly what the Bible tells us about the history of the universe, the origins of man? Because you started your talk, I have a lot of notes here, but you started your talk with the words of Jesus. Jesus and the apostles clearly taught a global flood.
Yeah,
That means we should believe them as well, of course.
that's right.
The genealogy of Jesus confirms Shem, the son of Noah. I like what you said, though. You said at the beginning, historical figures didn't come from mythical figures.
Hmm.
And so we're right there at Shem.
That's
And
right.
these people that want to say, well, Genesis is mytho-history. Well, where do they draw the line? Because as you were presenting there in your introductory point, setting the foundation, a verse that came to mind was Matthew 23:35. Obviously, we know that Jesus says from the beginning of creation, he made them male and female, referring to Adam and Eve. Theistic evolutionists and old earth creationists try to invoke rescue devices to get around that. But Matthew 23:35, Jesus says that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth from the blood of righteous who? Abel.
Mm-hmm.
So you have Abel right there, obviously a real historical figure.
That's right.
So, and who's Abel's parents? Adam and Eve.
Adam and
So were
Eve.
Adam and Eve
Yeah.
real or mythical?
Yeah.
So just incredible points to set the foundation.
Yeah.
And I got a lot of questions here, but before I ask you a couple of these, I just wanted to clarify. And so basically, if I understood correctly, and I have a lot of your articles and papers on this as well, so I recommend people check those out. The in these creation myths in Egyptian culture, the world is repeatedly said to rise again from the waters of noon. And so you're arguing that this is not necessarily Noah himself, but Noah's world after the flood, the earth being restored.
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we have two major versions of the primeval mound rising up out of the primeval ocean. So the first one is in Heliopolis. That's the Greek's name for where the sun god Atum was worshipped. So last time I said that, that makes a convincing case for Adam. So that was the creation version of the primeval mound. And then the other major version of the primeval mound is with the Ogdoad coming out. So that will be the flood version. And as I showed in the comparisons with Genesis creation and Genesis flood, the primeval mound is also there. That would have been what they saw at the end of the flood, with the mountains rising up out of the ocean.
Right.
And Genesis 1, God calling the land singular from the oceans, and the mountain appearing in Ezekiel's vision of Eden as well. So Egyptologists tend to think of the Heliopolitan version with the Ogdoad as just a creation myth, but I'm saying actually it's the flood version of Noah. So even in the Bible, we would have Noah and his family recreating civilization, agriculture, technology after the flood. So it just makes sense that their descendants would have looked back, or if they'd known Noah and his family personally, as the creators of the new world. And even in Hebrew, we have Noah as the second Adam. So these are definitely a creation version and a flood version in ancient Egypt.
That's really good and interesting. So in light of what you're saying and presented on, from what I'm seeing, part one, we looked at Adam and Eve in ancient Egypt. Today in your presentation, we shift to Noah and the flood. And so would you say we see a natural shift or move in Egyptian myths from creation themes and now to flood themes in a continuous narrative echo?
They're kind of compressed. The idea of creation and the flood, they're kind of compressed together. So the Ogdoad are creators for the Egyptians, but then the idea of a flood sent in judgment occur in other texts. So we have the texts from the Heavenly Cow in Tutankhamun, and then the Book of the Dead, and then the coffin texts. So they clearly reference the flood sent in judgment. And the interesting thing that I discovered, which I published in my dissertation for my master's, was that the Ogdoad names are punned upon in that particular chapter 75 of the Book of the Dead, in that papyrus description of the flood sent in judgment. So you can find the names punned upon in the text, just like you find the Hebrew names of Noah and his sons punned upon in the Genesis flood text as well. So the Egyptians themselves were masters of punning. They did this. Play on words is a very common thing in the Egyptian texts. And it just seems to be the inheritors of what the Hebrew writers did. So Lamech punning on his sons' names, and Noah would bring rest and comfort after the flood, and the Nu in ancient Egyptian means rest, comfort. It has that whole semantic range compared to the Hebrew for Noah. And I find that very, very striking, very powerful evidence. So it works well for Ham as well, mapping on to Kek, meaning darkness and violence. And Japheth, we have to remember in the Hebrew, is more like Yapet. And so we have to consider how sounds are transferred into different languages carefully. So Japheth is very much the anglicized version of the Hebrew Yaphet, and in Egyptian we would have similar sounding words, and I took the root again, and you find the same semantic range for Japheth as in Heh. So Japheth means spacious, wide. Heh means millions, expansive, eternity. And the only one that doesn't quite work is Shem, interestingly. And Amun of the Ogdoad means hidden of name. And when you find the men root of Amun, it refers to name and so, a title. So that works. But when you come to Shem, there are exact sounding Shem names, personal names and divine names in ancient Egyptian, but they don't have the semantic range as Shem. They actually share the same semantic range with Ham, which is interestingly. So it's almost as though Shem was written out of the equation.
That's interesting. Again, it's such fascinating information that makes sense if the account in Genesis of our origins and then the time after the flood, the rekindling of civilization and culture after the flood were true. This is kind of what we'd expect to find, and yet it is. And so I'm curious because, Gavin, from a biblical timeline, from the young earth timeline, which we would argue the Bible clearly teaches, Egypt arises pretty soon after Babel, after the Tower of Babel dispersal. And so some critics would say, well, there's simply not enough time in the young earth creation model to account for the shaping of Egypt. And so I'm curious, how do you see Noah's descendants, particularly those from Ham's line, shaping early Egyptian identity?
Well, it was the shaping there is in the language and the religious beliefs that were directly handed on from Noah to his sons, including Ham. And so that would have been paganized. And so Ham would have taken with him into ancient Egypt his understanding of creation, Adam and Eve and the fall, and also his first hand eyewitness account of the flood and surviving the flood and seeing the primeval mound coming out of the ocean, and the knowledge of his father's name and his brother's names were all carried with him into ancient Egypt, despite the confusion of the tongues at Babel. So, there are profound links there, linguistically and religiously, with Genesis in ancient Egypt that is far greater and far more interesting than anything you find in Mesopotamia or Sumer or Babylon. And it's consistent with Ham taking all of that with him. And as far as do you have enough time to grow a population, that's a very interesting question, and you have to work that out very carefully. I think if you look on creation.com for Dr. Rob Carter, he wrote a very compelling paper with another author on calculating population growth, and you can come to the modern population of 8 billion people very easily in the period of 4,500 years since the flood. And I think as creation authors, we need to concentrate more down onto that period from the flood to Babel to actually see how populations expand and can grow. And that's something I'm very interested in looking at as well. So watch this space for a clearer answer on that.
Yes, that's a great answer. I think it's been a while since I read his article and paper on it, Dr. Rob Carter. But I think he argued that all you'd have to do is double the population basically every generation, which is very conservative. And you'd easily arise at what we have. Actually, if the evolutionary model were true, we should find way more people than we do today.
That's right. Yeah, there should be far more artifacts in the graves, far more Stone Age bodies. They claim to find bones that are 100,000 years old. So where are they all? They just aren't there. There's no way near enough bones and bodies and artifacts if humans were around for a couple of million years or even just 100,000 years. It's what you find in the ground in terms of artifacts and archaeology is far more consistent with the biblical age of humanity.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've got his paper open right now. I was trying to find the exact numbers that he gives there just to make sure I'm representing it correctly. But either way, it's the bottom line is it's quite easy to account in a younger timeline. And like you said, even in terms of archaic humans, or you can go to Homo erectus, for example, that apparently, according to the evolutionary model, lived on the globe for between 1 to 2 million years. Mm-hmm. And so you could do the math if they had a generation time of 20 to 25 years and they were propagating. And I mean, we'd expect there to be billions and billions of dead bodies, yet we could fit every single fossil of erectus in basically the trunk of a car. So like you said, where's all the grave sites? Where's the evidence for 1 to 2 million years worth of civilization and history? Really, it's not there, is it?
Yeah, that's right.
So I'm curious, and that's a good, helpful response, Gavin. This one, we engaged a little bit in our last program, but it just being the nature of discussing the topic of Egyptian chronology, mainstream Egyptian chronology would place the first dynasties long before the flood. So what we're saying is you have the flood and then the Tower of Babel. I'm curious, Gavin, how long after the flood do you think the Tower of Babel event was? A couple hundred years?
Well, according to the Masoretic timeline, it's about 101 years.
Okay.
If you place that at the beginning of Peleg's life, but if you place it at the end of his life, that's about 343 years, I believe. So that gives you a bit extra time to grow your population but I think you can do it in about a century to arrive at about 10,000 people. So we're talking a century after the flood, where the Tower of Babel is, according to the Masoretic timeline. But if you hold to the Septuagint, which I don't personally, then you have a lot more time to play with. So a couple more centuries, I think.
Okay, so at max, somewhere between 100 and maybe a few hundred years. And would that be because in the days of Peleg, that's when the earth was divided?
That's right. Yeah,
People
that
moved
phrase,
out.
the earth was divided there. Contextually, it must link in with the division of the tongues, or the confusion of tongues, which caused the dispersion of the tribes throughout the world. So contextually, the division at Peleg's time must refer to the division of the nations.
Which makes more sense, I think, than the position that would say, well, this is when the earth itself broke up into plates and was divided that way.
I mean, that would cause a great flood in itself. So, I mean, actually, the creationist model of the flood is where the earth is split apart into the continents, which rearranged a couple of times during the flood to the arrangement that we have today. So,
Right,
yeah, the splitting of the continents would cause the flood itself.
So, yeah, that would be a post-flood, a post-global flood. So that wouldn't really work. Yeah. So, okay, in light of that, then.
The division of the earth in Peleg's time must be referring to the division of the tongues and the tribes. That makes sense contextually.
So in light of that, and I agree with you fully, since mainstream Egyptian chronology then would place that the first dynasty is long before the flood, what are the key assumptions or flaws in this timeline that you believe must be corrected? And in other words, those Christians, our fellow brothers and sisters who might not be experts in Egyptian chronology or Egyptology in general, when this kind of criticism is put forth by skeptics and critics, which is frequent, what is the best way to interact with that, Gavin?
Well, if you're interested, I have an entire talk on Egyptian chronology.
Okay.
And you could have me back if you want and talk about
absolutely.
Egyptian chronology at length. So, yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, Egyptian chronology is based on the 3rd century BC Egyptian priest called Manetho, and he wrote the first version of an Egyptian history. If you like, in contest with Herodotus, the Greek writer who wrote a Greek history, and Manetho tried to correct Herodotus in terms of his history, and he wanted to have, well, we can't prove it, but it seems that Manetho wanted to have a longer history for ancient Egypt. So if you had the longest history, that made you the most important nation, if you can prove your antiquity, your ancient history. So he dealt with all the data that he had to hand, which were the king lists. And so these king lists are basically lists of names of pharaohs, and they don't have dates on them, they're just lists. And so they were the pharaohs from the pre-dynastic periods through to the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the intermediate periods, right up to the later times. And what Manetho also did was include some mythical kings, if you like, that were called the spirits of the dead. And these were likely the memory of the pre-flood and the post-flood patriarchs. And that's what I've written about in my papers on Horus, papers 1 and 2. So that comes from the 12th dynasty Chirin papyrus, which mentions, it's a king list, but also has these spirits of the dead and incredible lengths of reigns that they had, which are very parallel to the immense length lifespans of the pre-flood and the post-flood patriarchs. And so Manetho added these to his history, and it's quite possible that, well, it's certain that at times in the Old Kingdom and in the intermediate periods, you'd have had pharaohs reigning in the north and the south and in the middle as well. And so if you extend all of these out consecutively, then you can stretch your history out by centuries, instead of realizing that at certain periods of ancient Egyptian history, these these pharaohs would have reigned concurrently, north, south, and in the middle. And certainly in the old pre-dynastic period as well, if we recognize that perhaps Ham and his sons were reigning different parts of Egypt, and their immediate descendants were reigning in villages, perhaps as chieftains, and they're considered as pharaohs, reigning one after another. That really extends the pre-dynastic and the Old Kingdom right out. So that would place the pyramids before the flood when you compare it to the Masoretic timeline. You don't have so much of a problem if you go for the Septuagint timeline, because it's extended by a couple of centuries. But then you have the same question before the pyramids. Where do you draw the line with pre-flood and post-flood? So it's not really a solution. I can say you can actually fit it all in the shorter Masoretic timeline. But the key thing to remember with the pyramids is that they're made out of sedimentary rock that are full of fossils. And these fossils are called nummulites. They're like little round things that look like coins. And Egyptologists have looked at the rock, and they're exactly the same as the rock that they're carved from. It's a sedimentary limestone full of fossils. So you can't have the pyramids made out of flood deposits that somehow predate the flood. That doesn't make any sense. Plus, the flood would have destroyed the pyramids anyway if they were built pre-flood.
Right.
If they redefined the world's continents and carved mountains and made new valleys and entirely resurfaced the surface of the earth, and the things like the pyramids wouldn't have stood a chance. So the pyramids themselves must be post-flood, because they're made out of flood sedimentary rock full of fossils. So it's the chronology that we have to try and work with. And if you're working with the Masoretic timeline, then you're working a bit extra hard to fit everything in. But I think you can do it.
Well, those are some really interesting points, and there's a lot there for sure that we could expand on, which is why it would be a privilege, Gavin, to have you back for part 3, specifically dealing with the question, because I know you've presented on it: can we align Egyptian history and the Bible? But one very specific point that you made that I really find interesting is that at certain periods in ancient history, these pharaohs were reigning concurrently. So rather than in a linear fashion, you have them reigning at different times in different areas.
Yeah.
And so if you were to take, as the way I understand it, the way you explain it, so if you were to take those, as some Egyptologists have, I guess, and have it consecutively rather than accounting for the fact that they're reigning concurrently, then of course that chronology is going to be extended far more than it is in reality, basically.
Yeah. So, I mean, Egyptologists like David Roll have tried to do that, but I think they do it in the wrong period. So he's doing it in the New Kingdom mainly, and there's far more archaeological evidence to make strong connections with the outside kingdoms of Israel and Mesopotamia. So you're having these synchronisms, what they're called, is strong anchor points with other chronologies and other histories that you can make a very powerful chronology with. So you have far more latitude to do that in the Old Kingdom, in the intermediate periods where there was chaos, and there's far less archaeological remains to make strong cases for chronology. So I would say particularly the Old Kingdom, you have far more latitude to do a lot more compressing. And so if you do your compressing in the Old Kingdom, that compresses everything up past the flood and into later history, and is far more consistent with the biblical period.
That's really good, which means in many ways what you said counters this common challenge. We do appreciate our critics here. We want to plant some seeds, get you thinking, and get you involved in the conversation. So this pertains to what we're discussing here. If Noah's flood was global, how did these ancient civilizations like Chinese, African, Egyptian all live through it and have no record of it? Well, firstly, I think you're showing in your hour and a half talk that there's a lot of record for it in Egyptian civilization. And secondly, well, these civilizations, the logical answer is obviously they came about after the flood. So no, they didn't have to live through the worldwide flood. They came about after the flood. Gavin, anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, he's saying that if Noah's flood was global, how did the Indus civilization, Chinese, African, Egyptian civilization all live through it and have no record of it? Well, that's what my talk was about, was the Egyptian civilization and their memory of the flood. So every culture around the world has a flood legend, and they're not just legends that are built on, this global phenomenon of floods. Everybody knows that there are floods that happen yearly, so that would be natural to think that different civilizations have stories about the floods, but there are points of contact with the Genesis account that you cannot account for in terms of just floods occurring every year. So there's always a boat that has a family, animals that go on board, and the idea that this is a flood that happens all over the world and that these are the only survivors. And so, yes, the Chinese do have their own legend of the flood. There are African versions, North and South American versions. In every culture, there are versions of the flood story, which were handed down after Noah and his family came off the ark, and after Babel. So the survivors of Babel, the different people groups that went out throughout the earth, they took with them their versions of the flood stories, which would have been handed on orally, so a bit like Chinese whispers, if you like, so that the get changed to the local version. So there'll be like a local mountain particularly that gets named in the tradition of that local flood tale, whereas in the biblical true historical account, it's the mountains of Ararat. But in other versions, it gets translated into a local mountain, or local animals, or local names for the flood hero and his family. But it's all evidence that this global event was taken after Babel to different civilizations.
I've heard two main rebuttals to this, and I'm sure you've heard them as well. I've heard them in debates over the years. Skeptics will argue that the flood stories are found worldwide in all these different cultures and civilizations because of common storytelling, not because of a real flood. And so I guess my question regarding that rebuttal would be, how do you distinguish, or what's the best way for us to distinguish, Gavin, cultural memory from literary invention?
Well, it's both going on at the same time, but there are the points of contact that you can see in each of the different versions that don't share a common thread when it comes to just ideas of floods or surviving floods. You could have so many different variations, but there is a common theme when it comes to a boat and animals and a family that was saved. And this is best understood that as a cultural memory that's been handed down from an original event that was a real historical event. It's the fact is that history becomes mythologized. Myth doesn't become history. It's the other way around.
Well, I think you nailed it. That if it was just common storytelling, there's just way too many details: the boat, the number of people, the flood itself. And so for that to all just be like some kind of independent story that different civilizations are coming up with doesn't make much sense. Some have said, well, yeah, all of these stories from these different cultures and civilizations, it sounds like a worldwide flood, but it's because in the past, at some point, all these different civilizations experienced their own local flood. And so back then, it's not like we have the kind of technology we have today, or where people are spread out to all parts of the globe. And so what they're seeing is a local flood that essentially covers all of what they know. So they describe it as a worldwide flood. But before you respond, wouldn't in many ways the answer you just provided that no, because we still have to account for the details, the ark, the people. It's not just the flood. There's other details associated with it that match beautifully with what Genesis describes, Gavin.
Yeah, that's right. So we have accounts in Australia with the Aboriginals, or native groups from Brazil, and Native American Indians as well. They have their own accounts of the flood. So how would you connect all of these if it just like came from a local flood somewhere? It makes far more sense to say that there was a global flood, there was an original family, right, and an ark and an animals, and that core concept of ideas was translated throughout the different cultures of the world, and ends up with the different flood legends. They're different in their ways, but they all have core elements that must have been handed down from the original historical event.
It's almost like a evolutionary phylogenetic tree. You have that core at the base, the flood story in Genesis, and then out there it's these branching patterns to all these different cultures and civilizations. But we have differences in the stories.
Yeah,
descent with modification, as the evolutionists would say. But that's just because that's how we tell stories as time goes on. Makes me think of the game of telephone, right? Where you've done it in school, probably. Everybody sits around the room. You start off with the basic story, and then by the time you get all the way back to the beginning, it's changed in many ways, hasn't it, Gavin?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I've got a question of my own, of curiosity, and it has to do with your talk. So let me see here. Okay. Are there archaeological patterns in early Egypt, such as sudden technological advancement, that match the rapid post-flood rebuilding described in Scripture, Gavin?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the ability to produce the pyramids is evidence that there was advanced human engineering and mathematics in that early population. Now, the Great Pyramid of Khufu, is huge. Over 2 million blocks. Many of those inside are enormous granite blocks weighing multiple tens of tons, put together so perfectly you can't even put a piece of paper in between the joins. So that implies an immense engineering prowess in the culture and in individuals in society. So where did that come from? And I would say that came from a percentage of the population of Babel that were capable of producing the Tower of Babel and the great city. And they came from the likes of Noah, who could produce a ship that could outlast a year's flood and take with it, thousands of different kinds of animals and humans and supplies, and be able to survive a global flood. And that's technology that's quite amazing in itself. So humans have always been brilliant from the beginning, and that's just evidence in the most ancient archaeology. The further you go back, the evidence for brilliant mathematics and engineering and the ability to move huge stones and put them in place incredibly accurately is right there the further you go back. So the oldest pyramids were in the 4th dynasty. That's when Khufu built his big pyramid. So you get the first one in Saqqara, that's the step pyramid, and then you get the bent pyramid and the red pyramid, and there's another one that's not quite a pyramid. So there were several trials before Khufu got his correct. So that there is a development there, but an ability from the very get-go to produce amazing works of engineering. And the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th dynasty pyramids were nothing compared to the oldest pyramids. They're really shoddily built, and only the tombs inside still carry the pyramid texts. But the later pyramids were nothing compared to the oldest pyramids. So you have to go back further to get the best technology.
That's a really good response, and it has me wondering, how far do we take? So, for example, before I was saved, going back years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I got myself into the whole idea of ancient alien theories, and they got the TV show, the book Chariots of the Gods. I read that a bunch of times before I got saved. And then obviously you get saved, and you hear the arguments and pieces of evidence that you present in creation.com, and evidence for man living to 900 in the past, and having that knowledge that we're not necessarily getting smarter, but we were smarter in the past. Obviously we have the accumulation of knowledge now, but not necessarily smarter. And so in these books and in these theories, they point out, and I'm curious how far we take these, in Egyptian archaeology, they got pictures of machines and UFOs. There's one where it kind of looks like a helicopter or something.
Yeah.
And so and obviously the ancient alien theorists, they explain that as well. Aliens visited us in the past and helped us with technology and so on and so forth. And so how far do we take those depictions that we might not be able to fully interpret in Egyptian archaeology, Gavin?
Well, that particular example that you mentioned, I mean, Egyptologists who read hieroglyphics would just laugh at that, because there's something called palimpsest, which is 2 layers of text that were written over each other. So there would have been an original hieroglyphic inscription in plaster, and then that was plastered over with more hieroglyphics on top, and they've been eroded. So one particular set of hieroglyphs looks a little bit like a helicopter, and another one looks a bit like a flying saucer. But that's reading into the hieroglyphs what's not there. So Egyptologists can read both sets of hieroglyphs quite well and know what the text is and the context of the hieroglyphs. So that kind of fringe thinking is very easily debunked.
Right.
I mean, in terms of there's the Dendera light bulb as well. That's another favorite one with the fringe theorists. Again, that has, if you know anything about Egyptian religion, that is perfectly reasonably interpreted in terms of the lotus and the serpent inside, and it's not a light bulb, it's the actual base is on something called a JED pillar. It's not electronic components. It's all readily understood in terms of Egyptian religion. But I mean, there are real batteries that go back to the are 2,000 years old, and they're the Baghdad batteries, and they really are real batteries in clay jars with carbon rods inside. And archaeologists have found that if they put like a mild acid, they will produce a voltage, and if they put those in series, you can stack up the voltages, which could have been used for something like electroplating or perhaps some medical treatment. So there are real advanced technologies, but it's nothing like what the theorists were saying in terms of aliens. You don't need aliens. You just need to recognize that humans were created brilliant from the beginning, because they're made in the image of God, and they're capable of great works of architecture and mathematics, and they're able to do great works of way back in history. The workings of very, very hard stone as well, to produce very, very accurate vases, and in the Old Kingdom, and diorite statues. Diorite is very, very hard rock. It's harder than granite. So how some of these statues and vases were created so perfectly is a bit of a head scratcher. But I don't think you need to invoke aliens to do it.
Well, the first thing ancient alien theorists need to do is get saved, read the Bible, understand the true history of the earth and the universe and man from the biblical perspective.
Yeah.
And so, as you were saying, some will take it too far. You don't need aliens. A lot of these things with helicopters and UFOs and stuff are readily explainable, but there still is good evidence of sophisticated technology in Egypt closely after the flood, which makes sense based on the overspreading of the earth from Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their families. And so, yeah, I think that's interesting, because don't take it too far, but we still have some good evidence for technological advancement after the flood. And so, as we start to wind down here, I really appreciate how thorough this has been, Gavin, and I look forward to hopefully a part 3 in the future. There was a lot of discussion in the live chat over the last 2.5 hours from skeptics and critics, and they were bringing this up. And we have Diana Fortune here in the live chat. I appreciate the engagement and energy from everybody in the live chat, both skeptics and non-skeptics. So if you're familiar with Diana, so she's wondering, there was a lot of argument. I noticed the same thing. I got several of the comments saved in the live chat about who wrote Genesis. I have heard Gavin's excellent views on this, but could he elaborate or enlarge? And she says, great talk.
Thank you, Diana. So, yeah, Genesis was, I think, compiled from more ancient records that would have been handed on from Adam through to Methuselah, through to Noah. So all of those patriarchs that we read about in the early chapters of Genesis, they added their colophon, their history, which would have been part of their patriarchal authority to hand on their history to their sons. So that's the part of the Toledoth theory of Genesis. So that I think that's very attractive, because it means that Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis, from creation through to the pre-flood history, 1656 years, and the flood, and then to Babel, they're all eyewitness accounts that were handed on in written form, and they would have been deposited in Egypt through Jacob's family, and eventually Moses, as redactor, would have edited those together to form Genesis. and included the accounts of Jacob and Joseph. And so Moses is the overall editor of those chapters of Genesis, as well as the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. So it's a combination of ancient histories, I think, that were eyewitness accounts of the true history of Genesis that were edited together under inspiration of the Holy Spirit by Moses. And I think what Jesus says about Moses and the authority of Moses actually backs that idea up. He wrote about real history. It's not just something that's like visionary that was given to him all of a piece by God, but that is real history that's been handed down by real historical people.
Which, as you've shown in 2 extensive presentations, very informative presentations, that the history written down for us is confirmed by many means. For example, in ancient Egypt, as you've shown. And so just to kind of bring everything home, Gavin, as one final question to wrap things up. Again, this was an excellent talk, and it really complements the first one. So for those who haven't seen the first episode or first talk from a couple of weeks ago, Adam and Eve in ancient Egypt, I do have it linked in the description box of this video, or at least I should. I'll double check when this is over. So please watch that one. Watch this one. They really do complement each other. And that way you get 2 episodes, 2 programs, Adam and Eve in ancient Egypt, and then Noah and the flood in ancient Egypt. And I've learned a ton in these 2 videos. It really is a great time to be a biblical creationist, as we've said. So, okay, so here's my final question. We'll kind of land the plane and maybe reiterate a few points to give people here to get them thinking. After years of studying Egyptology, Gavin, what makes you confident that Noah's flood is not only historical, but also reflected in the ancient cultures of Egypt?
Well, I start off with the Bible. So even if I didn't have any of that evidence in ancient Egypt, the Bible is sufficient in terms of its internal coherence and logic. The Bible is its best evidence. But looking out with biblical spectacles and with the eye of faith, we can expect to see evidence that corroborates the history in Genesis of creation and Adam and Eve and the fall and the serpent and the tree of knowledge and the flood and Noah and his family, passed on to Ham, who was the founder of Egypt, along with his sons Mizraim, Put, and Cush, whose names still can be found in Egypt, naming the actual countries and the parts of the country. So when we start with God's word and we look out, we will find evidence that corroborates that word in ancient history. And we start with God's word as real history and look out from there, and we find evidence that's consistent with that history, even though it's paganized, even though it's been changed around a bit. The evidence is clear to see when we start asking the right questions. We find the right answers. So start with God's word and you can't go wrong.
Start with God's word and you can't go wrong. I love it. Gavin, this has been an excellent talk. I really appreciate all the work and time that you've put into this fascinating study over the years. You've gone over a lot of the work and material that people can see in even more detail in your articles and your papers. For example, you have a paper at the ICC. And so I do recommend that people check that out. And reminder, make sure to watch the first video focusing on Adam and Eve. This was part 2, Noah and the flood, and some truly fascinating information, Gavin. So God bless you. I look forward to having you on the program again. And I'm really glad to see that this information is being spread now, being spread around as you give your talks, Gavin. So God bless you. And any final words, final thoughts as we wrap it up for this evening, Gavin?
Yeah, I just think the connections with the Bible, with ancient Egypt, are profound. And there's so much work to be done by Christian archaeologists who hold a high view of the Bible. And, it's there right with Israel in Egypt and the Exodus and the plagues and how that connects with ancient Egypt. There's a lot of exciting work to do, and linguistically as well. There are so many Egyptian words, native Egyptian words, that transliterated into the Hebrew. And that's something I didn't really touch on tonight, was the name of Noah's Ark in Hebrew is literally an Egyptian word that means a shrine or a box. And that particular box is associated with the Egyptian god Osiris. And Osiris went into a Tibet, and that's the Egyptian name of Noah's Ark, and survived the version of the flood. And so it's a resurrection of Noah, in a sense. So Noah survived the flood, and he was resurrected into the new world. And Moses used that Egyptian word for the Noah's Ark for a particular reason. Maybe he's saying that there are deep connections with ancient Egypt and Noah and the flood through his son Ham. So I think there's a lot of powerful evidence to be found linguistically in terms of borrowings from ancient Egypt into the Hebrew. So that's fruitful avenues of exploration still to be done.
Amen. I love all of the ongoing projects, the fruitful projects in light of the results going on in almost every field as it pertains to young earth creation, like you're saying in this study, of course, linguistics. You can get into the world of genetics, geology, astronomy. It's all pointing to one conclusion, that the Bible's true, that the Bible can be trusted, and we really need to take it seriously, which is brings another point. We can win arguments all day, but it's about giving the gospel. It's about winning souls. So for those critics and skeptics in the live chat here tonight, I appreciate the passion. I appreciate the criticisms and interaction. Hopefully we've planted some seeds and we've gotten you to think about these topics, because my review of these last two programs is, wow, if the Bible's true, then we should expect to find, we can make a prediction or expectation, we should expect to find these echoes that you've pointed out in terms of the flood and Adam and Eve, creation, so on and so forth, in these civilizations that came about shortly after the flood and Tower of Babel dispersal. And that's exactly what we find in far more detail than I ever expected, Gavin. You know, I always had the understanding that, of course, we find these echoes, but after seeing your presentations, I did not know we find it in this incredible detail.
Yeah.
So I've really been edified by these programs. I've got a link here, Answers in Genesis. I know that people can find a lot of your articles on creation.com as well. That's where I spent a lot of time looking at your work. And so I want to encourage people to check that out. Make sure you watch part 1, and hopefully we can get you in the schedule again, Gavin, and do something on the Egyptian chronology, because Egypt is just such an interesting topic, even for the unsaved. Before I was saved, you know, you're kind of fascinated with these movies relating to Egyptian civilization and culture, like The Mummy, so on and so forth. And so it's really interesting that we can now take the Bible and we have a biblical perspective in terms of Egyptian history. So really good stuff. God bless you, Gavin. God bless, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I appreciate all the comments, the questions, and the challenges. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. God bless you all. Standing for Truth is signing off.